Hello, my friends. This is Monday, September the 11th, and welcome to End Times Analysis. Get a cup of coffee, have a seat, and let's reason together. I'm Pastor Jeff, and we're going to be discussing Ezekiel 38:17. I shall read it. Thus says the Lord God, are you the one whom I spoke in former days through my servants the prophets of Israel, who prophesied in those days for many years that I would bring you against them? Notice that twice it is stated in this that the former prophets foretold this invasion. Thus says the Lord, are you the one whom I in former days through my servants the prophets of Israel, who prophesied in those days for many years I would bring you against him? God is asking a rhetorical question. He asks the first question first, and then he rewords it like, okay, do you really understand what I'm saying here? God foretold this. But then this is what gets a little bit of confusion from Bible scholars, theologians. Uh, but if you look at Joel 3 9 through 14 and Zephaniah 3 15 through 20, there are some allusions. And of course, there are other places where God talks about major enemies coming against Israel. Once again, if you are the traditional belief that Gog is the Russia, then a couple of things are going to have to happen here. One, Vladimir Putin is going to need a personality transplant because the Gog paradigm is rapid movement. It's acting quickly. It is flanking movements. He is coming down with a huge force. If you look at Syria, is Russia did not bring in any allies or even try to get any allies when it came into Syria. When Russia went into Ukraine, you don't hear about, with the exception maybe of Belarus supporting them. Once again, Russia did not reach out to allies, and they probably could have got some in Iran, which are selling arms, and even North Korea probably could have been much more involved. Once again, not doing it. Vladimir Putin is doing it alone. If you look at the old Soviet Union, with the exception of the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia when they brought in the Warsaw Pact, they were pretty much, we're going to do it by ourselves. If you look at the 1956 invasion of Hungary, the Butcher Budapest Khrushchev, if you look at the near invasions of Poland, they came in not too long before that, and in, of course, Berlin, where they sent troops in after some riots. And once again, Poland in '81, they did not come in, but according to historians, they alluded to it, and the Polish government came in and they did it themselves. They did martial law. So what are we saying? What are we looking at here? This guy who's going to be Gog, who is going to be the Prince of Rosh, Chief Prince of Misha and Tubal, is not going to have Vladimir Putin's personality. He is going to be much more forceful, much more, I'm not going to say organized, but much more flashy. He is going to grab and get a coalition. Vladimir Putin has so far not worked through coalitions. Of course, yes, there is the BRICS, but most people will say that China or even India has a greater influence on the BRICS than Russia, even though Russia is going to take over the presidency of the BRICS next year. And they're talking about different nations that Russia may nominate, may want to come in the BRICS. One of them is Venezuela. A couple of them, some people even say Cuba, Mexico even might even come into the BRICS, which would kind of make the determination on NAFTA. How would they handle NAFTA? But once again, if Vladimir Putin is going to do this, he needs a personality transplant. What we're looking at, if Russia is going to have this happen, once again, in order to have an army this size, I've said it before, you have to be very rich or your people are going to be very poor. The Russians have made these sacrifices in the old Soviet Union. They say many Russians uh, are very, very sorry that the empire collapsed. They are very upset that at one time they were, the the other superpower, the other thing that the other alternative to the West, and how could Gorbachev allow this to crumble? So there are supporters for the old ways. Say there are some, but there's a lot of people who have come up who have never lived under the Soviet Union. So it would be a major shock for them to go from the type of lifestyle they have now to a much more controlled, much more under a planned economy, much more where everything is being funneled to the military industrial complex. Just don't see it happening. Do not see it happening. So Russia is going to have to get richer, and that would not be hard. We talked about it before. If there is a commodity revolution, in other words, the fiat system starts taking a back seat, and more nations are dealing in commodities, Russia is loaded with commodities. I would like you to remember at one time, the Soviet Union could not feed itself. They had to do grain deals with the United States. Russia can not only feed itself, it can feed most of the world. Once the grain deal with Ukraine went down, Russia volunteered to feed Africa. Putin said, "I will send this grain down to you for free if you let me move my ships out with no trouble through the Bosporus Straits and through the Turkey Mediterranean." So we know Russia can feed itself. Now we're seeing with it becoming more isolated, it is getting up the old habit, even under the Tsar, one nation, one economy. Russia has enough natural resources, has enough things that it can produce just about everything it needs in that country. It covers 11 time zones. I want you to think about that. So if this is going to be Russia, they've got to get a lot richer, and they have got to want to lead. Yes, they led the Warsaw Pact. Yes, they led. I know everybody's going to say, "Oh my goodness, you're talking comic books." No, it was an economic forum under the old Soviet Union, Comcom, and it was an economic group, which along with the Warsaw Pact, like for example, there's NATO and then there's the European Union, Warsaw Pact, Comcom. It was an economic group. They have got to want to lead. They have got to be willing to lead and have other people follow. Right now, you don't see Russia doing that. You don't see Putin on it. So a new leader is going to have to rise up. The Gog paradigm is going to have to take over the Kremlin. Now, I want you to look at this, and we're going to read this. Are you the one whom I spoke in former days through my servants the prophets? God had prophesied God attacked. Gog's attack. Once again, this has caused some confusion, but we talked about that Joel and Zephaniah. Gog is really not mentioned personally in a lot of the other writings, but it says God did it, and we can look at other things. This is a rhetorical question. This is a rhetorical question. We've already said that. God is coming off and saying, "Oh, God, you're the one I talked about. Are you the one I did?" The Lord is bringing all this to pass. God is in control. But in order for this to happen, things have got to change. What has got to change in America, for, like I said, for us to let another nation come into the Middle East? What has got to change in the West, in NATO? Right now we control. We are the leader. I mean, you hear that bragged about from all the news media. We are the leader of the free world. We're going into an election cycle. And you hear not just the president of the United States, but the leader of the free world. What has got to change so the United States takes a back seat? There was something I want to recall that wasn't a very happy time. It was called the Vietnam Syndrome. After a huge defeat, after defeat in Vietnam, the United States pulled back and was not willing to get involved. The former president, Richard Nixon, wrote a book called No More Vietnams and others. And really until the Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where the United States military worked in a coalition with a lot of UN resolutions, did the United States military venture forth to take on a foe. And since then, we've been a lot more. Iraq, Afghanistan, different countries. We've been working through other countries in Libya, Somalia with Ethiopia, different areas where during the Arab Spring things happen. Still have stuff in Syria. There's many things happen, but what has got to happen for the United States to pull back so much, for Europe to pull back so much? Uh, do we find a new energy source? Or because under the former president, they said we were energy independent. Do we find energy sources? Do we turn? Do we make such great advances in green energy? Do we go nuclear? I want you to remember, I came from the '70s, and I remember the great hope of the '70s was the fuel cell car. It wasn't the battery; it was fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells. Does this happen? I want you to think about something. Way back when, the gas combustion engine did have a rival. It was called the Stanley Steamer. And no, I'm not talking about a vacuum cleaner. There was a car called the Stanley Steamer that came off of steam. Is there going to be some type of thing that we no longer need the Middle East, that we do not consider it important, that we do not consider a country? Now, think about it. We live under what we call the Western rule-based system. And that is, one country cannot take territory from another country and make itself bigger. We saw that they consider that was the prime cause of World War II. Germany, Italy, and other countries feeling slighted by the Treaty of Versailles, wanting more territory. Living room, the Germans called it. The Italians had a different name, and even the Hungarians, Bulgarians, other countries who were part of the Axis wanted that living room. What has got to happen to the Western rule-based system, that we're not sending troops there, that we're not coming in to aid, or at least, fighting a proxy type war? Hey, we're going to arm Israel to the teeth, and we're going to see what they can do, at least if nothing else, to weaken this other coalition. Many people think that's one of the reasons why we're so involved in Ukraine, because we want to weaken Russia via Ukraine in a proxy war. Once again, let's talk about the Gog paradigm. Russia, depending on who you listen to, has gotten another, or has just mobilized between 300,000 to 700,000 men, depending who you listen to. And they're ready. They're not right now in active combat, but they are ready to go into active combat. And we've had a couple different visitors from the EU, and Secretary Blinken have gone to Kiev. We don't know all the stuff that we know what they said on the news, but what was said privately. That is a very large army. The Russians are not going anywhere. I've even heard some commentators talk about the Korean solution, where we declare, or they declare, a ceasefire. Uh, no, oh, what's that word I'm thinking about? A non aggression pact, or something of that nature, where we just say, okay, we're going to freeze a conflict here, we're going to declare a ceasefire, and just hold it. A static freeze. That's a phrase. A static freeze along that. We don't know. But if Russia can stand up against the entire West, all of NATO and the United States, what kind of, as the kids would say today, street cred would that give it with the Gog coalition? What kind of street cred would that give it with Libya, with Kush, which we believe is Sudan and maybe Ethiopia combined, Persia, Iran, the Gomer, which many people think is Turkey, Tumamaga, the place in the far north, we said could be not quite as much as we think. Could be maybe Armenia and those areas, because Armenia does have some alliances with Russia. Magog, which a lot of people consider the stands, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the Central Asia. What kind of influence would that grab? Russia stood up against the entire United States and fought it to a standstill. That would bring about a lot of admiration. That's what you got to think about. And then if a new leader could come in who is much more charismatic, much more aggressive, much more uh, evangelistic, even, you can use a word. How would that change? Would that bring the God paradigm? And then, of course, a great military leader, because that is the way the Tsar and the Russias, of all the Russias, and the Soviet Union operated. They would have a political leader like Stalin or even Lenin, and then they would raise up military individuals like Zhukov. I think Tajikishev, I think it was. They rose up during the revolution, during the revolt, the revolution, and these two individuals worked together hand in glove. That's what's going to happen. A charismatic leader and a brilliant general be rising up through the ranks as we speak. And when Vladimir Putin and Mendeleev has taken off the scene, they could step in. We saw how quickly things changed after Brezhnev, Andropov, and Charenko died, and when Gorbachev came in, how quickly things changed in the Soviet Union to come back to Russia. Things can change very quickly. All right, so this is where we're going to stop, my friends. And until we see each other again, Maranatha.